live streaming it to YouTube. You'll receive a link of the recording after the event. If you have a question for our panel, you can pop it here into the Q&A box. Please only use the chat box to contact me if you're having any problems with your technology, sound, or video. We are transcribing today's event, so you'll find the option to turn on your closed captions here at the bottom of your screen. Please avail of this if you wish to see the captions. That's it in terms of housekeeping. I will now hand you over to the Chair of the Wheel, Paul O'Sullivan. Paul has been providing strategic advice to leaders of charity and social enterprises since he retired as Chief Executive of Plan Credo. At Plan Credo, he led the investment of more than 150 million into hundreds of community organisations, charities and social enterprises throughout Ireland. Paul served on the European Commission's expert group on social enterprise for 8 years. Before joining Plan Credo, Paul was head of GKPR's Employee Relations Division. Prior to this, he was a national negotiator for SIPTU, Ireland's largest trade union. Recently, he was appointed to the interim board of Waterford Area Partnership. Paul also lectures on the Masters in Civil Engineering Management programme in Trinity College, Dublin. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 2021 Charity Summit. Today, we hope to begin the process of outlining a vision for the voluntary sector, charities, community organisations and social enterprises. Yesterday, I must say I was delighted to hear on Taoiseach Micheál Martin express what he, and I'm quoting him, "My government's full commitment to supporting and empowering the voluntary sector." He promised to listen and to learn from the voluntary sector to bring about a more inclusive and empowered society. That is very welcome. We also heard from people like yourselves who are on how they coped with the challenge of COVID. And I suppose most importantly, which will be the theme of today's session, is how we build forward better. Most people have been saying that they don't want a repeat of what we had in the past, that we need to do things different and we need to do things better. And one of the things we need to do is to learn from the lessons that we've had of the pandemic and how community organisations, charities and social enterprise actually rose to the challenge. And they are part of what makes Ireland different. They're part of our USP. So as we begin to outline a vision for the sector post-COVID, we also need to identify what needs to be done to support the sector. In order to do that, we must effectively win public support and the support of public representatives. And I think it's worth looking again at the Caldwell report. That was the independent review group on health and social care. And it reported from its investigations that there was widespread agreement that the voluntary sector brings innovation, flexibility, independence, and a strong commitment to the delivery of services. By being rooted in communities, they said that volunteer organisations are responsive to local needs, and also that they're able to advocate on behalf of their beneficiaries. They went on to say that volunteer organisations build an inclusive democracy by enabling citizen involvement. These findings, although they were made in relation to the social care and health sectors, they're equally applicable to the entire voluntary sector. And it's great to be able to report to you that the Wheel has had significant and positive engagement with a wide range of government ministers and officials over the last period. And that has been very evident in terms of giving positive outcomes for both in 2020 and 2021 for our members and for the wider sector generally. We're looking forward to this relationship strengthening and deepening in the coming months and years because we are facing many challenges. All the challenges that were there before 2020 are still there. We have the post-COVID challenge that we face, and also we must work together to make a transition a just transition to a carbon neutral economy. I'm really looking forward to our next session, which we'll have a conversation between Minister Joe O'Brien, who's the Minister of State for Community and Rural Development and Charities, and he'll be in conversation with our CEO, Deirdre Garvey. Joe was elected a TD in the 2019 Dublin Fingal by-election, and he was re-elected in the 2020 general election. Originally from Cork, he now lives up the road from me in Skerries. He has a very good appreciation of the work that we do because he worked in the voluntary sector himself, and he undertook influential research on policy and advocacy work. He was appointed Minister of State in June 2020. Part of his ministerial role involves him having responsibility for the National Roadmap for Social Inclusion, and he was involved in the Department of Social Protection Budget 2021 negotiations, and he pushed for and achieved that the carbon tax would be used as an anti-poverty tool and secured that 1/3 of the revenues from the carbon tax would be challenged to the poorest in society. That resulted in increased fuel allowance, living alone allowance, and the qualified child payment allowance was also increased. The host of the conversation will be our Chief Executive, Deirdre Garvey. Deirdre has been Chief Executive since 2020, and she represents the interests of the sector with government, its agencies, both nationally and internationally. During Deirdre's time, the Wheels membership has grown year on year and is now representing over 2,000 charities, community organisations and social enterprises. And she leads a team of 24 people. And speaking of that team, it would be very remiss of me not to take the opportunity on your behalf and on behalf of the board to acknowledge their fantastic commitment and dedication shown by Deirdre and the team over the past 15 months. Teamwork that was seen was amazing, despite being physically distant, and everybody pulled together and did whatever was needed to deliver on behalf of the members and behalf of the sector generally. So it's now time, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Minister of State Joe O'Brien and hand you over to your host, Deirdre Garvey, CEO of the Wheel, for what I expect to be a very engaging and interesting conversation. Thank you.
Good morning, Minister. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on day 2 of our summit. It's fantastic that you're able to join us and the over 800 people that are registered over the 2 days. So it's been great to have you. I know you're a real passionate champion of community and voluntary charity social enterprises, and I look forward over the next 25 minutes or so having a good discussion with you. So, buckle in and very welcome.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. Very, very happy to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just to sort of get off on picking up on what Paul just said now in terms of welcoming the remarks by An Taoiseach yesterday, from the perspective of where he said that his government is, quote unquote, fully committed to supporting and empowering, our members and community and voluntary organisations and charities in their work. So as we all know, and it's been said yesterday a number of different times and in many different forums as well, past year has been a very challenging time for charities and indeed for all of us in our society. But it's been your first experience of coming into government and as a sort of a junior minister in a really area that's so close to your own history and heart. And I guess what has been your experience of minister over this time in dealing with the key issues related to the sector and what the sector is facing?
So we only have 25 minutes to answer, do we? Yeah, well, that's a big question. Look, obviously, it's been very uncertain for the sector. I suppose it was uncertain for everyone. If you go back 12 months ago in terms of what we were looking at, obviously the funding situation was very concerning to people. People didn't know if they were going to be able to keep people on. But I think the commitment that the Taoiseach spoke about, look, the proof is in the pudding, I suppose, in terms of what I would say for a start was the Stability Fund last year, the second bite of that towards the end of last year, and then more recently as well, the kind of new restructured one that's particularly focused, I suppose, on trying to help those organisations that didn't didn't get assistance in the first 2 rounds of it as well. So in terms of what the experience has been like, I suppose for someone who's worked in the sector pretty much all my life up until I got elected, it's been difficult in the sense of not being able to meet organizations on the ground and see people on the ground and stay connected to the ground and get the energy back and get the issues back. But it's very clear it's been, I suppose, very challenging for the sector. We've done lots and lots of online meetings, and when we were able to, there was a couple of in-person meetings, distance and all as they were. But I suppose the underlying uncertainty that the sector has faced for a very long time was heightened last year. And I hope that the Stability Fund and other funds as well, I suppose the CSP support program and other measures that we've taken have helped with that uncertainty, but have sent a clear message, I think, I hope, to the sector of the value that we place in them. But I am also heartened in terms of how the sector has adapted and how the sector has shown its value, I suppose, over the last 12 months. I don't think any government departments now cannot really look at their relationships with the sector and say, oh, you know, we need to strengthen these. We really relied on these relationships over the last 12, 14, 15 months. So for me, I'm delighted in a way that the sector has shown its worth in areas that perhaps people didn't realize it had worked as well. And there's a couple of reasons I think that happened, in that community voluntary sector can respond quicker sometimes in the state. It's got more of a presence, I suppose, as well on the ground, and that really proved of value. And it can innovate quicker as well. And I think the state can learn a lot from the sector in terms of what the community and voluntary sector did over the last 15 months or so. So, and then at the same time, kind of coming more closer to date, there is still a lot of uncertainty there as well, in terms of, you know, the country is opening up now. This week was a big week in terms of that. And there's going to be a different type of uncertainty going forward now when doors open up again, you know, so there'll be new challenges. A lot of them have already manifested, I think. And again, we have to thank the sector for identifying that and for reacting already to some of the new challenges. So I'll be committed to, thankfully now, hopefully this month as well, actually starting to meet projects on the ground and hearing them challenges as we go forward over the next couple of months and the next couple of years, and standing with the sector and supporting it as we meet the new challenges that, dare I say it, post-COVID world will bring as well.
Thank you for that sort of general sort of overview and personal perspective of where you've been coming from, because you said something there in relation to, well, you mentioned the Stability Fund. So to note that this fund had actually been announced, I guess, in the days just before our summit last year, when Kevin McCarthy, Secretary General with the department, spoke, and it was absolutely, I guess, fantastic to be able to give the update to the people who attended last year that the department had engaged in such an open and constructive and supportive way to understand the challenges and to do their best within the system to actually lead out on a response that ultimately became the Stability Fund. So I think it's really important to mark that and to sort of acknowledge that. And the way that it has continued in the latter part of the year last year, and indeed with the newly constructed version this year. And I guess that's a really interesting example of where I wanted to go next in terms of the changes, because we'll come back to the challenges facing the sector again, but just in terms of the positive things that have happened, you know, the innovative solutions that the sector was able to bring to bear, the partnership working between the sector and the state, and not just in the wonderful example that we all heard through those radio ads that played so often in our homes as we were working from home, many of us, you know, about the unique partnership between the government, the community and voluntary sector, and the local authorities. And that got came in over the months under this brand, the community call, you know, and the community response. And I think that was a really interesting partnership. But we saw it in many other places. We saw it, and our members are reporting to us, the enhanced relationships that the pandemic has brought, whereby the focus was less on the paperwork and I guess the accounting for pennies, but actually the focus on the people in communities and the outcomes, and the enhanced cooperation between charities and community and voluntary organizations themselves. In terms of an example of that would be those two examples and coming together, but also between the sector and the state. And it was really more about being seen as partners and on the same side, rather than as, I guess, subcontractors or people that would be commissioned to do a thing that the state wants to be delivered. So I guess in terms of trying to hold on to some of the good things, and we this phrase, build back better, and I think more people are using the phrase build forward better, actually, as a way of saying, no, we don't want to go back, we do want to go forward better in terms of the post-COVID world. Are there routes that can be followed, in your opinion, that would enable this type of cooperation to continue? You mentioned as a launch that you did recently at the end of March about a really important report that ourselves and Carmichael had commissioned with the partnership and funding of DRCD, which was about the support needs of community and voluntary groups, you know, and what's needed to help them make that contribution. And you had said at that point in time that you had written to all government departments to see how they were engaging with our sector. And I guess it'd be very interesting in the light of the question about how can we build forward better in terms of better relationship, better partnership between the sector and the state. And is there any update on whether the departments ever got back to you, or where you might be thinking of going with that? Because I think that would be very interesting to maybe package and bank some of those wins, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Gosh, there was a lot in that question there. So I've made a couple of notes, and I'll try to address a couple of the issues that you raised. I guess in a very general sense, going forward over the next few years while I'm in this position, I do see myself as having a role of championing the sector with other government departments as well, and pushing it up into their agenda and making them realise how dependent other government departments are on the sector generally as well. And I think as a whole, we are dependent on the sector for good advice in terms of how to do good public policy. Mm-hmm. We're dependent on the sector for exploring new ways of doing things. We're dependent on the sector for feeding up the issues from the ground as well. So going forward and sort of raising the consciousness of the sector within other government departments as a sort of a first exercise, I wrote to ministers and asked them, well, can you measure the level of engagement your department has had over the last 12 months? I didn't pick, it was 2019 as a sort of a more normal year to start with. And most of them have written back. Reminders have gone out to some. And very interestingly, some found it difficult to get their head around the question, partly because they were so enmeshed with the sector as well, and because they depended on it so much, they kind of thought, oh my God, how do we count all of this? How do we measure all of this? And so that in itself, I think, was useful to make government departments realise that we're talking a lot to the sector, but we're not really necessarily writing it all down and not perhaps acknowledging how dependent we are on them. So we're not finished that first exercise yet. We're a little bit of dialogue going over and back, kind of explaining what we're looking for. We weren't particularly rigid on the metrics that we were looking at, because this is the first year we're doing it. I do plan to do it every year. So there's a little bit of experimentation going on in terms of, well, what's the best way for departments to count this as well, or to measure it as well. But on the whole, so far, I think it's a very positive exercise because it's got departments thinking as well. So that's where that is at the moment. The whole partnership side of thing is the relationship is very important as well. And obviously our 5-year strategy for the community and voluntary sector was built on partnership. It was a collaboration between the state and the community and voluntary sector. And I think when when I'm engaging with other departments and other ministers as well, and when the officials here are doing likewise, something that we're going to continue to emphasize, because it had started before I came in here, is the broader value that community organizations bring as well. And you mentioned commissioning, you mentioned the sector being as a sort of a subcontractor to do something. And I think if government is doing that, and we do it a lot, there has to be a better recognition of the broader value that community organizations bring. So, for example, if a community organization is providing support to someone who's looking for a job, and that person really can't ever see themselves in a job, they've never had a job, they don't feel they have skills, their self-confidence is really low, they don't have a CV. If that community service brings that person from that position to thinking that, okay, no, I have a shot at getting a job and I now have a CV, that's an enormous value. And it's a value that perhaps we haven't been good at measuring as a state. And it's something that's possibly of more value than a job-ready person actually getting a job. And another service helping job-ready people get a job. It's a further distance traveled, I suppose. Yeah. And I use the phrase sort of a Freudian slip, but our SciCap program does use this tool called distance travel tool to specifically measure that kind of what some will call soft progress, but for someone who's really in that situation, it's a very big step. So I suppose that's just a little example, I think, of the level of understanding I'd like to push in government departments as well, and the appreciation levels, I suppose, for what we do, because a lot of these services as well, a lot of services is such a reductive term, but a lot of community and voluntary organizations, they offer a safe space, they offer an open door, they're trusted, and like trust is huge if you're trying to do something new, if you're engaging with new people. Trust is such an essential element, and a lot of these small community groups across the country have that. And I'm not sure that's always measured, something to procurement or commissioning or whatever. I'm not sure there's a number put on that, but there should be. I don't know how we do it, but it's not always done, I suppose. So those are some. Yeah,
and I guess picking up on that, in one sense, the trust issue and what the hard to measure, the intangible benefits of that kind of relationship of trust with community organizations, large, small, and everything in between. You realize when you don't have it as a society, when you look back over the 15 months and the relationship that individual people have had in terms of the sense of solidarity, the sense of shared common good, in terms of the amount of restrictions that people have been allowed, they have imposed upon themselves for the benefit of others. And I think that's that glue that keeps that trust flowing in society. I know we certainly in the wheel and our sector would see very much the fabric, the soft fabric of society in that sense, the invisible fabric, which is anything but soft, because actually it's that kind of interrelationship and interconnectedness that I think we've really as a country been able to bank on and draw on our reserves, in that sense over the past 15 months. And I guess maybe if I could come up with a suggestion in terms of how we can do that. I guess we spoke before about bringing those community call people together, not just the departments, but if there is no answer about how to progress the relationship and how to make things more of a, I guess, partnership style, we're on the same side here, working for the betterment of communities and people. Maybe in one sense, there are ideas that no one fixed answer will come up with it. Maybe it's really complicated, but maybe I guess an initiative that involves the sector to try and actually just come to terms with how we can contribute from our shared perspective, from 360 degrees, as to how to embed initiative, because I know it's something that you mentioned before in terms of bringing people together to try and answer that question, together.
Yeah, no, I do think we need to put all the key actors from the Community Call initiative back together. And in terms of timelines and being practical about it, I think we're looking at perhaps the autumn now. And to look back on what will then be the last 18 months and particularly reference the NESC report, which really kind of named the value of the Community Call and the new things that were done, and to see how we can retain it and build on it as well. And I think a lot of it is about investing in people as well. And I want to draw this in because I think that's a key role that the state can play in terms of the community voluntary sector. And we have prioritized it in terms of the 5-year strategy as well to get some progress on that this year. And we've identified 3 levels of organizations to firstly do a needs assessment on. Primarily, number 1 is local community development committees. We'll have a report on that at the end of June. Then we're looking at boards of management of smaller community and voluntary organizations. And then kind of third, we're looking at the really small community groups as well to see how we can support them. So it's a bit of quid pro quo is the wrong word, but a bit of recognition that that the state needs to support the sector, and one way of doing it is to invest in the people as well. And I think in the week that's in it would be remiss of me not to mention volunteering week as well, a national volunteering week, and just to flag our commitment to that as well, with the fact that we've opened 7 new volunteering centres this week across the country, and that's not just a signal. That's hard evidence that we do value the sector broadly speaking as well, but particularly potential volunteering, and volunteering in a safe, structured, valued, and very publicly recognised way as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you pick up there, I think rightly, on the very important need to focus on people, and investment, I guess, in keeping people within organizations, paid or unpaid, to be able to, I guess, make their contribution in the best possible way to the public benefit and the public good that every charity or community group or voluntary group or social enterprise, we all have that thing in common, that we exist for the public benefit. I guess one of the issues that our members are signalling really loud and clear in that space is the real challenge in relation to staff and people, volunteers as well in the sector, including recruitment, progression. I guess mental health issues and burnout, are highlighted as issues in the report that you launched back in March, but we're seeing it again in every wave of our member survey. And that relates to practical issues about, a level playing pitch in terms of working conditions, between the organizations in our sector and indeed the organizations and similar work that's being done in the public sector. So it's a real challenge in terms of actually being able to, I guess, staff, and I mean that in a sort of paid and unpaid sense, but staff the engine room that these organizations embody in terms of partnership with the state. So initiatives that tackle, I guess, that issue in its entirety would be important, I guess, over the coming while, because that is one of the single biggest issues we're hearing from our members.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I draw from my own experience here as well, that when you're in the sector and you're at the front line, you're there because you choose to be there, because you're really committed to a particular issue or a particular community or a particular way of doing work, and everything comes in the door, and you don't necessarily have an easy filter or an easy way to close the door as well. So it can be overwhelming even at the best of times, not when there isn't a pandemic. So I think particularly for a lot of organizations over the last 15 months or so, particularly those that were dealing with a lot of the new issues that were coming in large volumes, it's been very difficult. And I suppose it's about the question of sustainability as well, in terms of what you as an organization or even as a person can do and can commit to doing over a long period of time as well. Because my experience of getting things done and getting some level of social change, be it small or bigger than that, is that you have to stay with it. You have to keep plugging away. You have to be persistent. So, you have to measure, you have to get your head around how you can keep doing that, I suppose, over time, even when it's really difficult, and when the pressure is on, because sometimes we just won't be able to deal with everything that's coming in the door or coming into the service, or you know, coming through the phone as well. So that sustainability in the non-green sense is really, really important, for the sector.
Yeah, and we actually saw in the recent reports published by the charities regulator that funding and organisational sustainability is actually the key list that charities have in terms of the impact of COVID. And I guess just in drawing the session, our conversation to a close, because we're actually in the last 5 minutes. It's actually been really interesting to talk to you. But in terms of the session that we're now heading into, which is where we have a really interesting panel looking at the role of the community and voluntary sector in shaping the future of Ireland. Let's call it post-pandemic, let's call it build forward better. But really it's just society, the economy, life as we know it basically in Ireland, and indeed our interactions with the international community, you know, and in the week that's in it, we're seeing Ireland play a major role in the global landscape in relation to the terrible, I guess, tragedy that is unfolding in the Middle East. But in that context of shaping our future in Ireland and globally, and just give you an opportunity about what your thoughts are, your wishes, your vision, where you think the wheel and indeed the voluntary sector can make our best contribution from your perspective. This would just be great to hear from you before we wrap up in that regard.
Sure. I mean, I think I have no one set vision for the sector. The sector makes its own vision, I guess. And I am always conscious of it. When we say the sector, we mean so many different things, and it's very broad and it's got different meanings for everyone. But I think we're generally 99% agreed on what we're talking about, so that's good enough. I suppose the beauty of the sector is that it's kind of fluid. If you're trying to picture it as a shape, it's constantly moving and it's constantly getting into spaces that the two other sectors, say public and private, don't do as much. So I think if you were to kind of look at its future going forward in relation to them two areas, public and private, I think there's relationships that can be developed and enhanced on the public side of things. The public third needs to understand the sector better, and I think that's part of the vision that the community and voluntary sector sells its value, explains its value, make sure that the public side understands the breadth and the full holistic nature of its value. And I think on the private side, there's things to be done as well in terms of how the community and voluntary sector engages with the private side. We will hopefully at the end of next month have a landscaping report published on the whole area of philanthropy. That's an area for future development. And I think there's good things coming as well in terms of the whole area of social innovation. It's something that happens on the ground in every community in one way or another, but I think we're going to look forward to putting more of a shape on that policy-wise going forward as well. So the sector makes its own vision, I guess, but I suppose I would see myself and ourselves here in the department as of having a role to kind of make the space and give the supports to let it do that. I suppose that's where I would situate ourselves.
And do you have any final or closing remarks that you wish to make in terms of anything that I haven't asked you that you wanted me to ask you? Now,
not usually. I suppose I'll go back to the week that's in it in terms of National Volunteering Week, and just to acknowledge all the work that people have done, not just over the last 18 months, but over years. I know a lot of people in their communities, they just do it. It's second nature to them. And we shouldn't take that for granted. It's really important not to take that for granted. And maybe just to flag something as well that'll be coming up next week as well, our own SciCap program and the local development companies that man that and implement it on the ground. The work that they've been doing over the last 15 months or so as well has been extraordinary, and a lot of it has gone under the radar, and it's something that we'll be pushing out and promoting next week or the week after. I'm not sure we have the dates pinned down yet as well, but just to acknowledge all their work as well.
Yeah.
And just to say that I think on that whole social inclusion side of things, I think that's where a lot of the value of the sector is and will grow into as well, I think, over the next couple of years. And I'll certainly be supporting it to go in that direction too.
Right. Well, Minister, with that, I will thank you for your first, I guess, appearance at the Wheels Annual Summit. And thank you for your time. Thank you for the work and the commitment that you've made to the sector. And indeed, you know, in working with the Wheel over the past, not quite a year since you've come into the role. It seems like a generation has passed since then, and yet it's not even quite a year. So thank you again, and I will hand back now to Paul, who will introduce the first, I guess, the panel session of this morning. And I will say thank you very much from a personal to you, Minister, and indeed to all of the people who've come along this morning and today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Deirdre, and thank you, Minister. I must say that was a really impressive conversation, and in my years I've listened to many ministers speaking at various events all over the country, but it's the first time I would say that I ever got the sense that this is a minister who really understands the sector and understands the diversity and also the value of what it actually brings. It was, you know, it was like eavesdropping on a very informed conversation, and thank you both for that. I suppose I just want to, I was taking notes during it, and there are lots of very good things in what was said there. But it was great to hear about a minister saying that he saw himself as championing the sector, that the sector's role is providing good advice to government. And it was great to hear that about him raising the consciousness of the sector across government departments and actually asking them to identify their level of engagement with this sector. The recognition of the added value that the sector brings reminds me of the work that was done by Community Foundation Ireland, my own parish, Cloncriadio, and the Wheel back 5 years ago, I think. Commissioning for Communities, that was basically talking about the unique societal value that the sector brings to the contracting and commissioning process and the need for that to be recognised. So it's great to hear that being highlighted again. And the role of the sector and its involvement and the need to have it involved in shaping public policy, I think, it's great to hear. And as Deirdre said yesterday, the Wheel is now calling for a multi-sector dialogue to develop Ireland's post-pandemic recovery plan. And it is really important that actually takes place. So public policy must be informed and shaped by the people and the communities that are affected by it. So this theme will be picked up in our next session, the role of the community and voluntary sector in shaping the future. This second plenary will be identifying some of the learnings from the recent experience of what can be achieved when our differences are put aside and the sector and the government and the funders work together on a common theme and common aim. I would like to introduce you to our chair for the session, Professor Tom Collins, Educational Policy Analyst and Chairperson of DIT. Professor Collins is the former Head of Education at Maynooth University. He was Dean of Teaching and Learning, and he was Emeritus President of Maynooth from 2010 to 2011. He was the founding chair of TU Dublin in 2019. And for the past 2 decades, he's been one of the most influential voices in the evolution of Irish education policy at all levels. So over to you, Tom.
Good morning, Paul. Good morning, everybody. And thank you to the Minister and Deirdre for setting the scene so eloquently earlier. The themes that emerged earlier will be amongst a number of other themes which will be addressed by our diverse and expert panel, drawn from many different spheres in Irish voluntary and public and private sector life, contribute their thinking on some of these issues. The panel will be addressing the theme of the role of the community voluntary sector in shaping the future. The theme itself, I think, is optimistic because we live in a world facing so many existential crises that the notion of a future is probably for the first time in Western civilization, in human civilization indeed, no longer taken as a given. Not so much with COVID as much as with the wider environmental crisis. So there is no doubt that there is a really major requirement for a collective mobilization towards resolving many of the great issues that have come very sharply into focus over the last couple of months and years, and in the climate case in the last couple of decades. So to begin the conversation, there will be 5 speakers. Each will speak for 5 minutes. And if you wish to log any questions into your Q&A section, please do, and we will have about a 30-minute conversation after the 5 speakers have presented. Our first speaker is Tracy Monson. Tracy works as a works on children's and young people's issues in Ireland on cross-border basis, north and south. She is chair of the advisory committee of the Children's Research Network in the Trinity Research in Childhood Centre. She is a member of the TUSLA Research Advisory Council and works also in the early childhood and social care teaching domain in Dundalk Institute of Technology. So Tracy, I'll hand it to you.
Great, thank you very much, Tom, for the introduction. And thank you, Deirdre and the Minister for, as Thomas said, setting the scene. And I'm delighted to be here just to give some input in terms of, I suppose, the learning for the community and voluntary sector and how we are positioned to move forward during these uncertain times. I suppose I'm mindful that we now are 14 months, I suppose, since the pandemic really impacted on Ireland and being the most challenging time for the community and voluntary sector. But it has brought about a rejuvenation, a re-energisation, and really a magnification of the values that underpin the services and the work that we do, those that we serve. We are very mindful that our staff have shown wonderful initiatives and blue skies thinking, and they've benefited from stronger working relationships with colleagues both within and outside of the sector. And they have grown professionally hugely while also having to manage the impact of the pandemic on their own personal lives. 14 months on, we are beginning to get a clearer understanding of the impact of COVID-19 on the world and on those that need the support most. Many of the services are overwhelmed with referrals, ours included, endorsed of Charity, Child and Family Services, and increased demands. But the strength is that the agility of the sector to shift, and in many cases to completely transform how services have been delivered, has been remarkable. One of the strengths of the pandemic has been to enable a focus on partnership, collaboration, communication, and a joining together in solidarity among the sector, both within the sector organisations working more effectively together and working collaboratively with statutory services and our partners within communities and policymakers. Because the reality is we are all united in the common agenda of keeping everything going for the public good, which is the core values that underpin the sector. There's a recognition that we are all trying to achieve the same thing, and that all sectors have been impacted by the pandemic, and that we work better together. And we've had really strong evidence of how that's happened over the past year. And the Minister has highlighted some of that. And a really strong recognition that the values that we all share are the common glue that has held us together during these challenging times. Just very mindful as well of the past year that why we have all become so dependent on technology as a means of connection. And this has enabled us to continue to connect, communicate and collaborate remotely and to keep services going. Very, I suppose, mindful and acknowledge the significant challenge that the recent cyber attack now presents for colleagues, specifically in the HSE in Tusla. And I suppose that the community and voluntary sector are committed to supporting them and working in partnership with our colleagues in the united goal of responding to those that need us most and supporting them in their work during these challenging times. And the strength has been that we draw from those renewed partnerships and respect for each other as sectors that has shaped how we've worked during the pandemic. And we have been able to really develop such strong connections as a sector over the past year. For the sector, I think, and for society in general, the cyber attack has highlighted that relationships and understanding and compassion are actually what is key. And these are the cornerstone of how we do our work. Technology can be no substitute for meaningful connections with our service users and our colleagues. And there is a danger that services will place too much of an emphasis on technology as a means by which to continue to deliver services into the future, rather than seeing technology as a tool. What the pandemic has reminded us is that people make the connection, not technology. And this is the cornerstone of the community and voluntary sector and the values that underpin. People will need to make those human connections now more than ever. And this really has been a valuable lesson from the pandemic. And we know that this is something that we need to be very mindful of in the future as a sector when we're thinking about what we need to do moving forward. We also know there's been a real commitment from government to the sector, and the Minister highlighted that earlier on, and we've seen this increase specifically in funding initiatives and grants that have helped us to continue to function and to develop new targeted initiatives to respond to need. We've also seen an increased inclusion of representation of the sector in transformational changes at a policy level, and this is to be welcomed, and the commitment from the Minister in this regard is also of great value and of great comfort to us moving forward. But we know there are significant challenges that we will continue to face. While all the focus has been on service provision during the pandemic, and rightly so, there are matters for the sector that still require resolution and existed pre-pandemic. So a significant underfunding of the service since 2010, the increased focus on governance and compliance, while of course is welcomed, this does need to be funded. The real cost of service delivery and how services are commissioned will also need ongoing work and resolution. And we know there has been a significant investment in the government, in the sector, and indeed in the budget, but the uncertainty of future funding due to reduced budgets is a challenge for organisations which are already impacted by deficits in fundraising and reduced income. Another challenge is making sure that we support our staff, and a renewed focus on well-being will be required to deal with the trauma of the pandemic that has impacted everybody personally and professionally. Making sure that we can carve out space within society as well as within the sector to reflect on their learning will be important and will help us to understand need into the future. And we know there's also strong national and international evidence now that we can draw from that we didn't have this time last year at the conference. We've learned so much, and we have huge data that can help us to deal with emerging needs moving forward. Some of the issues we're facing relate to mental health, domestic violence, decreased support in terms of social interactions, childhood development delays because of closures of schools. There are challenges for us moving forward, but I suppose to conclude, with our colleagues in the public sector, we will work well together, and we know that the community and voluntary sector have demonstrated great leadership and vision during the past 14 months. The relationships and the collaborative working and partnership have grown and developed so deeply, and we can adapt and change and develop quickly and effectively. There is a real opportunity for this continued partnership to remain and become embedded into the fabric of policy and service provision in how we do our work. And the pandemic has helped us to break down those silos, entrench belief systems and thinking, and unite us in our most difficult times. And for us now as a sector, we face into the uncertain future, but with renewed leadership, strength, vision and wisdom. And we're looking forward to meeting that challenge head on. Thank you.
It's a very optimistic conclusion to your input. Our second speaker is Peter Casals. Peter will be known to many of you. Peter is currently chair of the Dialogue Forum, which deals with relationships between the voluntary health and social care sector and the state. He's the outgoing director of the Edward M. Kennedy Centre for Mediation in Maynooth, where he was also deputy chair of the governing body up to a couple of months back. Peter came to national prominence, of course, Secretary General of the Irish Congress and Trade Unions, where in the 1990s he led 5 partnership programs, the negotiation of 5 partnership programs. So the theme of partnership has been a recurring theme already this morning. Tracy has just dealt with it, the Minister and Deirdre did also. There's probably nobody who knows more about it than Peter. So I'm going to hand it to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Tom. I want to thank Tom and indeed Paul, who have been both personal friends of mine for a long number of years, and also to thank Deirdre and Ivan for inviting me to say a few words at this summit. The first thing I just want to say is that for all of you in the community and voluntary sector at the summit, I believe that there is now a big opportunity for the sector to shape the future of health and social care here in this country, and to shape it in collaboration with others. I'm saying that for 2 reasons. One, personal, in that for family reasons, I'm involved in 2 organizations in the disability sector, and already arising out of COVID, I can see the improvement in relations, particularly with the HSE. And secondly, because of the Dialogue Forum that Thomas just mentioned, it was established by the Department of Health, and the overall aim that the department gave the forum was to build a new and stronger relationship, a more collaborative relationship between the state and the voluntary organisations in the social care and health area. On the forum, you have obviously the Department of Health, the HSE, HICWA, the Mental Health Commission. And on the voluntary side, I'm not going to mention them all, but you have the Wheel, obviously, and the Disability Federation and the National Federation of Voluntary Providers and the Community Care Networks and that. And Ivan Cooper, who I've just mentioned, and also Jackie Horton, who'll be known to many of you from Cope in Galway, represent the Wheel on the forum. Now, we all know that with the cutbacks in funding over the years and the sort of standardized operational procedures, and I suppose confusions about roles and that there has been a problematic relationship between the HSE and many of the organisations at this summit. Paul mentioned the fact that it has been highlighted in the Catherine Day report. Now, arising from that, the forum commissioned Dr. Damien Thomas of NESC, and the Minister mentioned this, to look at whether tackling COVID was changing things in a systematic way, and to talk to all of the organisations that I've just mentioned. The report, building a new relationship between the state and the voluntary organisations in that area of health and social care, as I said, it showed a number of things. The obvious one being the importance of health and social care to people in this country. But it also showed, and this is important, is that we have a hybrid system of social care with the state, community and voluntary organisations and the private sector. And that's the case in some other countries as well. Now, a hybrid system like that, of course, means you need and have a high level of interdependence. An example being without that interdependence is that 60% of the disability services in this country are provided by voluntary organisations, but 80% of the funding comes from the HSE. And all of them is not just funding, work under a national framework, a policy framework. So for all of that to work, that high level of interdependence hybrid system requires a high level of collaboration. And the difficulty, as I mentioned earlier, as the Day report says, well, there is a problematic relationship that needs to be looked at. Now, Damien Thomas's report and the work he's done from the forum on the COVID showed a number of things. So what was emerging is a unity of purpose. The second thing he showed was that there has been, during this 15 months, intensive engagement and collective problem solving in the sector. It also showed, and Deirdre mentioned this earlier, that there was a greater focus now on communities and in protecting the most vulnerable, leading to much greater cooperation at local level through the local crisis teams, and that there was strong collaborative leadership and indeed an extraordinary commitment and flexibility from staff, which needs, as was mentioned, to be recognised in due course. Now, the fear is, and Tracy mentioned this, how do we embed this? The fear being that it will slip back to where it was before all of this happened. But I believe that's the opportunity. And I believe the opportunity is in the HSE's response, especially from the CEO, Paul Reid, who said, and it's worth, if you have it, looking at it, the National Service Plan from the HSE, where he says that building a new, more collaborative relationship is the key to reform and a more equitable, person-centred services. So that's what he has committed himself to trying to develop with the voluntary and community sector in this area. So what's the next steps? And I'll finish on this. First of all, the Dialogue Forum will be meeting next week, where it will publish the report I've mentioned on building a new and stronger relationship between the states and the voluntary sector in that area of health and social care, to start a conversation around that. It will set up a process to look at, in a collective way, the design and overall delivery of services in this area post-COVID, and that is going to be crucially important. It will also look at the input the voluntary sector will have into policy reform and sláinte care in this new context post-. And the last thing then is, once we've made progress in those areas, to develop a charter setting out partnership principles that for the future should underpin that relationship between the state and the voluntary community sector in social care, so that there won't be any slippage back. So I believe there is an opportunity there. I believe in particular for Ivan and Jackie representing you, there's a big opportunity there. And I just want to commit that you will have every support from this end in trying to achieve that. So thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Peter. It's just really interesting and hugely innovative. I wasn't aware of the that you just dealt with. It sounds so interesting and incredibly timely to be dealing with it. Our third speaker today is Anne Irwin. Anne is the National Coordinator of Community Work Ireland, which of course has a long stage working as the voice of full-time professional community workers. She has an active involvement in a very wide range of social issues, in particular issues with regard to social inclusion, with regard to poverty, human rights, travellers' rights, and sustainable development. And she's a member of the group which produced the strategy entitled Sustainable, Inclusive and Empowered Communities. So Anne has a deep engagement with the community sector in Ireland. So I'm going to hand it to you, Anne.
Just a tiny bit of context, because I've got a slightly unusual position in that I work part-time for Community Work Ireland on a national basis, and was very much involved in our work there around COVID and our response to COVID, which included work to convene up to 30 NGOs to discuss responses to COVID with a range of communities such as travellers, migrants, homeless people, disadvantaged local areas, etc., and developing a planning for resilience framework that was used throughout the country. But I also work part-time at a local level and was part of the Community Response Forum in Galway City, and was, for example, knee-deep in developing the referral pathways for people at the start of the COVID pandemic. So I've got kind of that dual understanding and that dual role. But this morning, I'd really like to speak to you about what I'm calling 3 potentials and 1 necessity. And a lot of this has been said already, and I will, echo some of the words that Peter and Tracy have used as you will hear throughout. The first potential that I would see is the potential in crisis. And we all know that, that saying, never waste a crisis, and I'm hoping that we won't waste the crisis. So this particular crisis is and continues to be the pandemic. And what we saw is that the pandemic did not create any of these vulnerabilities that we as a society sought to protect against. It did highlight or draw attention to issues such as poverty, particularly food and fuel poverty, inadequate housing and accommodation, homelessness, inequality, precarious work on which we as a society depends. It definitely amplified issues such as domestic violence, loneliness, health inequalities, and the enormous one that is the digital divide. I think it shone a new light on the importance of public services and essential workers, and critically on the community sector that rose to unprecedented challenges in truly incredible ways. And as we emerge from this particular crisis, our choice is, as others have said, whether we want to return to normal or whether we want to build a new normal, drawing on what we have learned and building on the new relationships and new possibilities. Because as I would see it and as I had experienced it, the pandemic shifted ways of working. And this for me is the second potential, the potential of collaboration. Because we did see new ways of talking and working across sectors, a new sense of solidarity, a new, as others have put it, this unity of purpose. And a good example of this is how, for example, the travel organisations worked at a national level with public health, and how local organisations, local travel organisations, and I'm a director of Galway Travel Movement, worked in new ways with public health and local authorities to put in place measures that the traveller movement all over the country had been seeking for years or even decades. But the pandemic in a crisis made things possible. And this brings me to our third potential, and that is the potential of infrastructure. Because this collaboration was possible because there was a community infrastructure in place. But that was not the case for all areas, nor is it the case for all marginalised groups. So for example, we know in Galway, as we scrambled quite recently to develop a response to Roma and how COVID was affecting the Roma community, that infrastructure didn't exist. And it's the same for migrants, it's the same for very many marginalised communities, where the community development infrastructure that did exist has all but disappeared. And that brings me to my final point, and that is a necessity, the necessity of investment. And the necessity to shift our understanding of the community sector, and in particular, obviously, I'm going to say for community development, and to embed it into planning for future, and indeed into the current crisis. Because the pandemic is not the only crisis we face. We see the rise in discrimination and racism. We see the movement of the far right gaining ground. We see the rise in inequality and the prospect of significant educational disadvantage for young people that will just not bounce back into education after missing out for so much. And we also, of course, face the climate crisis, and in particular, from our perspective, climate justice and the need to work with communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change and have least resources to adapt or to mitigate against the worst of what we are now facing into. So what we would say in terms of investment is that the state now needs to view the work of the community sector not as something to be funded, but something that they need to invest in as a fundamental part of society that is not just dependent on philanthropy, and that is something that is a real partner and not something to be commissioned, and also not as a charity, but based on the right of people to live in a just and equal society. And
hugely interesting again. This notion of infrastructure strikes me as a particularly interesting observation because of the danger or the risk it exposes that a society which hasn't got that infrastructure, it has no capability for civil society to operate. And groups that are excluded from civil society are marginalized in every sense, it seems to me. And their marginalization, of course, became apparent in the middle of the height of the COVID crisis in very particular ways. Our next presenter is Sarah Monaghan. Sarah works at the Wheel. She's the campaigns manager. It's interesting. Her role is not described as campaign manager, but it's campaign plural. She's a founding member of the sorry, I can't even read my own writing here now. Of the you're going to deal with that one yourself, Sarah. But was a key figure in the 8th Amendment, in working successfully on the repeal of the 8th Amendment, and was the director of the campaign to re-elect Michael D. Higgins as President of Ireland. And Sarah is also a member of the Women's Council of Ireland. And it's together for my own writing. Sarah, can you remind me of that one?
Yes, I can. Happily, I can. Yeah, so it was a founding member of Together for Yes, which was the civil society campaign.
Oh, yeah.
The 8th Amendment. Thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here this morning as we look towards the future together. But to start, I want to take, as others have done, just a very brief look at the recent past. And over the last year, again, as others have mentioned, I think we have all experienced a fundamental shift in values in society around us when confronted with those dramatic changes to daily life, with uncertainty and with struggle. People realised that the most important things in their lives were unquestionably that of health and happiness. It was friends and family, it was community and human connection and helping those who were vulnerable. And the values that underpin those fundamental priorities are the values of equality and equity. They're the values of justice and inclusion and fairness. And these are precisely the values which underpin and provide the foundations for the work done by the charity, community and voluntary and social enterprise sector. And for each of us who are here today and indeed those who are not, who work and volunteer in the sector, they are the values that get us out of bed in the morning and which drive us to deliver incredible work and to provide life-changing services and supports and commit to passionate advocacy. And the pandemic, I suppose, has simply brought the priorities of society at large in line with the values that we have always advocated for. And as we now slowly start to emerge from COVID, we have that opportunity, a very important opportunity, and I would say even a responsibility as a sector to ensure that those values are not demoted within our broader society again. And while others have spoken today about the vital resourcing and funding and partnership models which are crucial to support the sector's role in this, I would like to focus on the public engagement, which is also required for us to be a key player in rebuilding a society that is just and equal. And currently, there is a fundamental lack of understanding of the work that our sector does. And naturally, that lack of understanding, that kind of inability for the average person to close their eyes and to imagine what we do every day leads to a lack of general appreciation for the value, the immense value of that work. And this lack of understanding and that subsequent lack of appreciation is a major factor in all of the decisions which people make about our sector. And that's seen across a wide variety of audiences. It impacts on our ability to progress policy change. It impacts on our ability to fundraise and to engage with the general public. It impacts on our media coverage and our relationships in that regard. It negatively impacts on our recruitment and our retention of staff and volunteers. And it also impacts on staff and volunteer morale and pride within the sector. And, I think it is easy perhaps to minimize the importance of essentially how the sector feels about their value within society, especially alongside a long list of competing challenges. But I think we're learning in that regard, and we've really recognized that it is important. The morale of the sector has a direct impact on our strength and our resilience to shape a future which addresses inequalities and so, benefits those whom we provide services and supports and advocacies for and with. So the sector has now a collective responsibility to stand tall and make our impact known. And as the sector is a sum of its staff and its volunteers, if we are not the ones to the forefront of promoting the work that we do, and if we are not the champions of our own impact, then who will be? So as much like the pandemic has brought us back to the basics of family and community, we need to start reverting back to the basics of storytelling for public engagement. Stories create that emotional, empathetic connection which bring us together. Stories put the human face on statistics, and while data and research is ever important, the most compelling arguments lead by the heart. It is the heart-to-heart connection, the story that draws people in, and it is that which then creates the platform and the environment which is then receptive and inquisitive for that further convincing argument, for that further information and data. And I think it's also important now because stories lift that veil of mystery as to what it is that we do all day. What does it mean to work in a charity or volunteer in a community group? And that is important. Transparency does not only refer to governance, it also means letting people in so that they understand the work that we do. And more importantly, perhaps they understand the why which fuels our work. Stories replace that uncertainty, that ambiguity with a narrative around the lived impact of our work. So over the last 6 months, we have been working with partners on a collaborative pansectoral campaign which aims to tell stories of our sector, to convey the impact which all of our organisations are having on a daily basis. The campaign will empower and support individual organisations to tell their story, but while also providing that strong overarching national framework which bolsters the message of our sector as a whole. So through this, and by working with all of you, we aim to make the general public more aware of the impact of our sector and the value which it then holds, to make our staff and our volunteers prouder to articulate the message of what they do, and in turn to make policymakers and institutions more supportive of our vision for the future. Because we need to ensure that those core values which have now been brought to the fore do not disappear again, and instead are cemented as central to shaping that better future which we are all working to create. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And that brings us to our final presentation of this session, which is from Amy Woods. Amy is Communications and Diversity Manager at Volunteer Ireland. Her primary role is in creating public awareness around volunteering, and Amy is a member of the National Volunteering Strategy Implementation Group. So I'll hand it to you, Amy.
Thanks very much, Tom. So I guess just to set the context of my contribution today, Volunteer Ireland is a national volunteering development organisation. We work with and support a network of 29 volunteer centres around the country who locally deliver supports to volunteers and organisations. We celebrate and promote volunteering, we deliver training and resources to organisations, and we advocate on behalf of volunteering. And as Minister O'Brien kindly mentioned a couple of times in his conversation with Deirdre, this week is also National Volunteering Week. So as you can imagine, my contribution is very much framed through the lens of volunteering. And when I say we, I guess when I'm talking today, I'm talking about not just the experience of Volunteer Ireland, but the experience of volunteer centres on the ground locally. So this session is about shaping the future, but much like everyone who's come before me, I think to do that, we really need to look at the past, albeit the recent past. What happened during COVID? What is it that we saw during COVID-19 that will help us shape the future of volunteering and through it the sector? So for us, we saw a huge desire for people wanting to volunteer. On our own database alone, over 30,000 people indicated they want to volunteer directly in response to COVID-19. And research we did with Ipsos last year showed that 75% of people wanted to volunteer during the pandemic. We triggered by a lot of things like people being out of work, people having more time, or just wanting to help in response to something so specific and immediate. You know, for many people, volunteering was a way to do something and to take action. And I think what we also saw was a huge number of people wanting to volunteer, but maybe not necessarily the amount of roles for people, actual volunteer roles. You know, there was a real kind of mismatch there just in the nature of the pandemic. And I guess along with that, what we also saw was a huge rise in informal volunteering. So this is, you know, people kind of coming together in groups locally or with individuals, checking in on neighbours and friends just outside of organisations. And then for organisations themselves, the experience really varied greatly from what we saw. Some had to completely shut down their volunteer programmes. They just simply couldn't, you know, undertake their activities anymore. Some were lucky and able to move their programmes online, adapted really quickly, and, you know, the nature of their work just really allowed for that. And then some organisations just needed volunteers more than ever before. And we also saw a lot of new roles created, like at the COVID-19 test centres or at the community call, which has been mentioned a few times today. And I guess with all of that, what we really saw was how critical it is to maintain good volunteer management, particularly in the face of a crisis. And I know others have mentioned here today the collaboration across the sector, and I think that's another big thing that we learned from COVID-19 was that huge level of collaboration, both at national and local level. Like the community college is a great example. You know, we would have sat on that nationally, like with colleagues like the Wheel, and the volunteer centres would have sat on their local forums, and it was really that, you know, collaborative process across the sector, but collaboration from the ground up as well. And I think not just in response, you know, not just the delivery of services, but also in advocating for support for the sector, like with the Stability Fund. And I guess one other thing we saw, which probably was not because of the pandemic, but was very timely because of the pandemic, was the publication of Ireland's first ever national volunteering strategy. So what can we learn from all this? Well, how can we shape the future? What are the challenges and opportunities we have from this? And I think volunteering, there is a big challenge, but I think there's also a real opportunity for organisations to capture that desire to volunteer and that increased public awareness of volunteering. I mean, we had people beating down our door looking for stories of volunteers throughout the last year, which, you know, it's usually the other way around. And I think that's something we can definitely capitalise on. And I think the challenge here is that as things open back up, organisations are going to be competing not just with each other for volunteers, but with the fact that we're getting our lives back. We all have things to do and places to go. So volunteering might, you know, drop down the list for some. And in that research I mentioned earlier, 62% of people said they wanted to volunteer post-pandemic, with only 40% of those expecting to do that formally and 54% expecting to do that informally outside of organisations. So it is a challenge, but I think it's something that organisations can embrace. You know, informal volunteering has always existed and had been increasing even prior to the pandemic. The pandemic naturally saw a big explosion of that. But I think it's up to us as organisations to think about how we can encourage people drawn to that type of volunteering to engage with us. Do these people even consider themselves volunteers? Maybe because of the pandemic, people who didn't consider themselves volunteers before actually recognise that they're volunteers now and understand more about volunteering in general. And I think this recognition and awareness is something organisations can capitalise on. I mean, how do we engage people who really want to give back and get involved, but just don't identify with those traditional forms of volunteering? I think what we really need to do is understand why people are drawn to this kind of volunteering. Is it because they saw this immediate need and felt compelled to respond? Or do they just prefer the ad hoc nature of informal volunteering? How do we harness this? And I guess, you know, much like a lot of my colleagues today have mentioned, this kind of engagement takes resources. You know, volunteering doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires resources and capacity within organisations, and we need to build that. Something we work on all the time. We're working on a number of capacity building projects at the moment, and it's also a big focus of the National Volunteering Strategy. And I think in terms of shaping the future of volunteering, a lot of that lies in the National Volunteering Strategy. It's very optimistic and it's very ambitious, but I think it's our job to ensure that it's delivered, and it helps organisations on the ground, helps us retain and recruit and manage volunteers so we can deliver our services and meet the needs of our communities. So, you know, it's an exciting time, I think, for volunteering. We've learned so much in the last year about the needs and desires of volunteers and the challenges for organisations. But we've also learned a lot about the adaptability of organisations, how everyone just so quickly responded and adapted, not just with their volunteering programmes, but with the organisations as a whole, the sector as a whole. And I think now we have a really unique opportunity to take these learnings and challenges as we shape the future of volunteering and through with the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. And I have to say, I'm really struck by the 5 panelists, and thank you to each of you for your insight and for the information you brought to this session. I'm hugely struck by a common theme with all 5 speakers, I think, which is that COVID triggered a massive community voluntary response that was latent out there, that was possibly largely ignored by the state prior to that, that was certainly under-resourced by the state prior to that, but that this huge reservoir of capability suddenly mobilized itself around COVID in a way that strikes me that even listening to the 5 speakers, I'm hugely struck by it. And I suppose the question I would ask the 5 speakers is, in one sense, I'm not surprised to hear that, even though I hadn't realized it. But a bit like the London Blitz in the Second World War, when people nostalgically refer to it as a time where communities mobilized to support each other, you kind of do expect in a society that there will be a mobilization in a time of crisis. I recall in the tsunami in Southeast Asia, and reading a report on it and a comparison between that and Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, in Louisiana. And the argument was that the tsunami in Southeast Asia got an instant local response because there was a capability in the communities there to do it. Whereas that capability had already been largely obliterated over years of despondency and underdevelopment in Louisiana. So when Hurricane Katrina struck, civil society was not able to respond to it. And here we are now with COVID. Irish volunteerism has clearly shown it having a robustness and a muscularity. But then the big question is, of course, it seems to me that the big learning is not so much for the voluntary sector at all in it, but it is for the state. Can the state actually realize that here is a sector, a huge resource that it has to for decades? And Peter, I think, considering that you're in a very central place there as the interlocutor between the social care and voluntary sectors, or the voluntary sector in the social care and health areas with the state, what do you think of that? I was very struck by your observations, by your reference to, for instance, Paul Reid's observations with regard to the Thomas report. So maybe if you might start that, I'm using my prerogative here by presenting the question, but while doing that, I'm urging the now 220 participants to begin bombarding us with your own questions. So Peter, I'm going to go to you first, but I'd invite all the panel just to reflect on how the state might, apart from funding, which of course is always going to be an issue, how else it might take on board what this sector brings to it.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. And like you, I thought the contribution from the other panelists in that I've learned a lot, in fact, from some of the elements of what's happening. But one of the things I've learned from being involved with the Dialogue Forum, which maybe I didn't have a strong appreciation of before, was that our system of social care is a hybrid system, as I mentioned earlier, between the state and voluntary and community sector and elements of the private sector. And that does, for it to be operate in a way that will deliver high quality, person-centered, flexible services, needs to be a highly collaborative process. And I think we lost that. And we lost that for, I think, two reasons. One, there was an obsession, probably around the time of the cutbacks and funding and that, there was an obsession with new forms of public management, where the idea was you set targets, you commissioned the service, and then you imposed standards. And you forgot about the person-centered, you forgot about the flexibility that was needed and the innovation, but more importantly, the involvement of the providers of the services in the design of the actual services and in the policy making. Now, I think if COVID has done anything, it has shown and exposed to everybody that flaw and the need for that to be dealt with. I know that people's big fear is that we will go back to where it was if this isn't dealt with quickly. And so therefore, in that context, that's why I was heartened by Paul Reid. When he made that statement as part of the National Service Plan, despite how busy he is, I had a long session with him on Zoom, naturally, discussing all of this. And I have no doubt that he is very committed to trying to move these things forward. Now, the HSE is a big organization, and part of the difficulty, in fact, is how to change that culture that has grown up of where its role was simply commissioning service, a contractual relationship, setting targets and insisting that standards be met, opening that up to a much more open, involved process, multi-annual funding, much greater engagement in, as I said, both the design and the delivery of services. I'd be optimistic, but it's not going to be easy. I mean, we're all coming up with the right language now around it. And I've noticed this in terms of before a partnership, which you mentioned I was involved in. When people asked me over the 90s, was I for or against partnership? My answer was always yes. I'm for it when I can work with the people involved, when they recognize that it has to be a collaborative approach, when they respect everybody, a mutual respect, developing shared understanding of the issues and problem solving. I'm against it when people are exploiting people, when people are not respecting people, and where they're not engaged in the way that we're talking about. So it's that approach. I wouldn't be sort of naively drawn into that this is all going to work out. A hard-headed approach is needed, but I'm confident from what I've seen so far, both of the input of the representatives from the Wheel on the Dialogue Forum and the determination of Paul Reid to turn the HSE around, as it were. And indeed, the HSE have submitted a paper to the forum, which was discussed throughout the organisation and senior management. And again, I will be optimistic that that will happen. And also look at the board of the HSE. Again, the board has changed significantly, and there are probably a number of friends in court, as it were, there for the voluntary and community sector.
Right. That's very interesting, Peter. And I have to say, your reference to new public management, which you glanced by there, is a really astute observation, where the technocratic as opposed to the democratic priority gains priority. But let me hand it to the other panelists. As any other panelist, any comment that you'd like to make on that overall question of how the state might respond to the realization that all of you are drawing to our attention today, that this is a huge, available, ready and capable resource? Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. I suppose from a different point of view, again, like I think we as a sector really have to remember and value our own contribution into creating that vision, and like, you know, vision in its kind of fundamental sense before you get to those very important mechanisms that Peter is speaking about and that others would speak about, you know, more eloquently. You have to create that picture for people of what does a future look like, and that is done through telling the story and the impact of the sector. And I think, you know, you heard Minister O'Brien earlier talking about the sector makes its own vision, and I think we really have to take that on board and commit to that, you know, now before the moment kind of passes us by. You need to give people something to believe in. You know, you need to give people, whether it's government or it's general public or anyone else, they're all people. They need to be able to see where we're going. So create that destination for them. What does it look like? What does it even feel like? You know, so that's kind of your first step, is laying those values-based foundations so that everybody can imagine where we're getting to. You're creating a vision that is a better future than the you know, present that we're in now. And so then you kind of get into, I suppose, the specifics of the mechanisms of what we need in order to make that happen. But I think we have to make sure to hit that first step, you know, as well of what is the vision, what does it look like, so that you can inspire everyone to actually want to get there, to come on and be committed to prioritising the sector, because they can see the value of it and they can see how it has a central role in actually, you know, creating that future that we all want. And I think that's, you know, as everyone has touched on, that's what COVID really brought to the fore for all of us. We actually have that shared vision already. Once we're kind of put to the test, it's already inside all of us of what we value. So let's make sure we don't underestimate our own role, which I think we do sometimes in creating that vision for people.
Sure, Sarah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else? Anne, yeah, come on in. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I just think there's two slightly different audiences, and I think you're right, Sarah, in terms of, you know, raising the profile and garnering that good image that has been of the sector, has been developed of the sector over the last few months. But I wouldn't suggest that it's all rosy in the garden either, because what our sector should be saying is we need to prioritise the rights of people and the rights of marginalised communities such as travellers, migrants, women who are experiencing domestic violence. I won't go on, but so it's that sometimes can be a hard sell to the public. I know that from experience. So I just think we need to be, while doing that, we ourselves need to be very clear that in selling this image of a sector, the sector itself needs to be clear that we need to focus on the most marginalised communities, the communities that need to be supported in terms of equality and human rights, and in terms of public services. One thing that I do absolutely think that we need to be pushing is the public sector equality and human rights duty. It has enormous potential to be transformative in the way that public agencies, public services perform their duties to sectors that are protected under the 9 grounds plus 1, which is the socio-economic ground. And I think that we as a sector need to hold on to that, whilst at the same time selling that message, which is critical because we're all in it for, we do need resources to survive. But I do think we need to keep our focus on that.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah. Tracy, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, thank you, Tom, and thanks, Anne and Sarah, for your contributions there. I agree with those points. I think what you've highlighted, Tom, is important in terms of the experience in the US. And I think the strength of our sector is that, I suppose, the community and voluntary sector were services when there were no other services in the state. So we were the groundwork, we established services. And I think that those values, and I suppose that underpins everything in terms of that's why perhaps we garnered that fantastic response during the pandemic, where it was everybody came together, because that is the value system on which our services, or all services, are built. I think the other thing that's important to point out is that if we're thinking about the future of community and voluntary sector, what I'm always struck by is how are those that we serve experiencing our services. And actually, when it comes down to it, service users, or those that we serve, don't really care whether it's a public service or a community and voluntary service. They just care that they get a service or they get a response when they need it. And I think what has been hugely valuable has been, we have seen, especially in Dorset Charity and China Family Service, we have seen a shift in terms of how there has been engagement with the state services and ourselves, because it has been about the service users and those that we serve, and that has been the common agenda. And I think it is important that we do position ourselves in terms of a sector in shaping that vision. But I think we can walk more hand in hand than we ever did before, because of the fact that we are united in knowing what our service users want. And all they want is a service. They want to know it's available, it's flexible, it's delivered, it's, all of those things are critical. Those common values, I don't think really matter when it comes down to whether a family, or, in our case, get services or not, whether it's a public sector or a community and voluntary sector. But I think that we are hugely well positioned to be able to drive that response now moving forward in terms of shaping the future. So I think that's important as well, just in terms of the learning over the past year.
Thanks, Tracy. And Amy, I'll give you an opportunity to reflect on.
I was really struck by what the minister said when Deirdre asked him about his vision, and his immediate response was, it's your vision. It's your vision as the sector, and we're here to facilitate that, and mentioning about feeding from the ground up. And I think for the state, that's really the crux of it. We're a competent professional sector. We work on the ground in communities of all shapes and sizes, rural, marginalised, disadvantaged, day in, day out. We know what we're doing and we know what's needed, and it's the state's role to support that, to facilitate that, and ideally to fund that. And I think that's the kind of mismatch a bit sometimes, is that it's almost dictated from top down, where it really needs to come from bottom up, because, we know what's happening on the ground, we know what's needed. And I think the state, it's their job to recognise that and to facilitate. As the minister said, we were able to respond quickly in a crisis, we were agile. And I think they need to, as a state and as a funder, embrace that and allow us to do that by kind of providing that support and funding.
Okay, Some of the comments, thanks Amy, some of the comments coming in chat are interesting, and the focus on Sarah's reflections on visioning, getting some very positive feedback, and also Anne's reflections on marginalisation coming out. And I just picked up a slight, I would say, different approach on the marginalisation issue as between Anne and Tracy. Now, I'm not trying to create any dissension here, but I do think the voluntary sector has always had an issue between working around service, improving the efficiency of services, as opposed to actually maybe designing locally based solutions to problems of impact. Is there, and there has that been divided tension, I think, within the voluntary sector for as long as I've been observing it in many senses. But I'm going to deal with that question slightly differently around COVID, and I'm going to ask you all one general question, which is this. It's widely recognized that the European liberal democracies did not handle COVID very well, and that China did. So the question of, and if the voluntary sector, which I think we're all recognizing is a key component of a democratic society, ready to, whether it's better direct services, such as what Tracy might have alluded to, or better mobilized, marginalized, such as what Anne might have alluded to, or more effectively create articulations between the state and the wider community, such as Peter has alluded to. That regardless of those three roles, I'm not sure if the voluntary sector is particularly strong in China, but they seem to have done a much better job on this issue than we did. Is there anything, maybe it's largely outside of the remit of this sector, but if China was reviewing its approach to COVID, to what extent would it say, if we'd had a voluntary sector there, maybe we would have done it differently? I'm just, come on in, Anne. Thank you. Yeah, I thought I'd silenced everybody there.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in all of this, but where we look at what did work, in New Zealand, for example, and other areas like that, I know lots of people have pointed to the fact that the leadership was female, and I think that's a useful consideration to make. I think in terms of some countries like China use very strict controls as opposed to sort of servicing the needs, I think, which is what Ireland sort of looked at. But I do think the way that we responded to COVID in Ireland had its challenges, because I do think that in a lot of ways it challenged agency. For example, it certainly challenged the agency of older people. I think, there was a bit of reductionism there, and I know a lot of older people, especially that I know, would have said, we have become passive recipients, whereas what we want to do is we want to be participants. And I think that, yes, there's always been this tension within the community sector, but I think that's just an indication that the community sector is so broad, and that our particular, certainly from Community Work Ireland's perspective, our particular niche is on that particular part of the sector that works with community development. And community development would absolutely emphasise the absolute need and requirement for people to be participants and not recipients, and to have the right to have a say, the right, in terms of a say in decisions that affect their lives. And that's absolutely critical. So I do think that, there's always going to be that tension, but I don't think it's an either or. There are obviously services that are required. That's just not what we're particularly talking about. And I just go back just in terms of Sarah's introduction, which I thought was really interesting. A couple of years ago, we wouldn't have thought we would have had marriage equality or abortion in this country as a right. And those demands came from civil society, and they came from a wide range of civil society organisations, whether you're coming from a community work perspective or not, working together again towards that common good. And that's what I think we need to build on, is our commonalities as opposed to what divides us.
That's very interesting, Anne. I'm really happy for anybody to come in on any aspect of this, and I'm also looking at the chat lines coming in. There is one line on the border communities and on this sector, but before I go that, I am interested in the tension, and it was actually Peter alluded to, the tension between the technocratic solutions, the NPM solutions, and the more negotiated participative solutions, such as you're referring to, Anne, that notion of agency. And I'm interested in the tension that is in there as between agency and technocratic decision making. And as I said, in that, I think, is something to do with the theoretical construct of new public management. Peter, do you want to come back in on that?
Just pick up that point, Tom, and I accept totally now, just to acknowledge in terms of my own contribution and what and Tracy and others were saying in that. I mean, I'm very focused on the social care area, particularly the disability sector, and secondly, obviously, given my background in the trade union movement and with yourself and Manute and that, you know, I do tend to be very focused on processes and collaborative engagement in that. Yeah. And so I'll acknowledge that, and I acknowledge that the background to all of that has to be very much driven around human rights and equality and that. But just to acknowledge that for a start, that you're getting a narrow start to slip here from myself. But in the context of this, I do think there are overlapping circles. And it's overlapping circles, as I said earlier, between the state, the voluntary and community sector, and others. Now, within those overlapping circles, it does require everybody to be involved at every level in the making of policy, the design, the delivery of services, and accountability of what they call sort of accountable autonomy, as it were, or indeed Paul Reid explained to me as being tight and loose. But within that, we have to acknowledge that while the state has made significant mistakes, in my view, in the past, and that new public service management and confining the sector to just the commissioning of services, putting and then standards and then imposing constraints. At the same time, we have to acknowledge we're not going back to a situation of where the state or the taxpayer funding will just hand out money to voluntary organizations and say, you know what you're doing, you're there on the ground, you get on with it. It is actually, as I said, overlapping circles. And in that context, we do have to acknowledge, and I've experienced it myself even during COVID, that not all organizations responded in the way we're talking about to COVID. I mean, a number of the organizations went missing. A number of organizations were very slow in terms of how they collaborated with others in doing it. And there's a big need for organizations in the different sectors, but particularly in the disability area that I'm familiar with, to collaborate with each other in the delivery of services, because many of them are too small and are in its precarious positions, funding-wise and capacity-wise, to be able to deal with the needs of the future. So that's why I'm emphasizing that process of partnership, collaboration, and the underpinning of things with those partnership principles.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's absolutely clear. I don't know if Tracy or Sarah want to come in on any aspect of this debate. Tracy, you might pick up the border point that was made as well.
Sure.
I don't know if you saw it on the chat line, but I know you're based up in Dundalk, or at least you work there.
Yeah.
The issues for border communities in the likelihood or in the event of a debate on this notion around the evolving nature of Ireland. So you might pick that one up while you're
yeah, absolutely. I suppose what I just wanted to mention as well, just in relation to your well-made points around how China responded, and I know you know, it is a very different governance structure What I suppose I would highlight is what we saw during the pandemic was a focus on management of risk and threat and danger. And I think when all of those things present to a government or to a society, the response is not always collaborative. It's not always around seeking views. It's not always around agency or participation. It is very much around managing a risk. And I think what's important for us now to consider, as Anne has mentioned, is, how can we include the voices of those that are impacted in terms of a critical incident response? Because sometimes what we can do in services is we can think that what we're providing is what's needed when it's actually not. And so it's really around responding to need rather than managing risk. I think that's something that we need to factor in. In terms of the border counties, so I suppose my organisation would provide services in Dublin and surrounding areas. So we do have a service in Arklow, and we've an earlier service in Mosney. And I think what has worked really well, actually, and maybe it's a Dublin thing or a rural thing, is that the rural communities have come together extremely well, because there has been such limited services always in rural communities, and I think they work exceptionally well together. It's not as differentiated as it would be in Dublin, and I think we've definitely seen that in terms of there's been a very strong coming together in terms of the different services, state, public and community and voluntary in those areas as well. And I think what's happened as well has been, possibly with remote working, there has been a shift of services back out because people have been able to work remotely. They've been able to, embed within communities without having to travel and commute. And I think that's also going to strengthen the way that services can be delivered into the future as well. But there does need to be, I suppose, a separate consideration in terms of, more rural counties as well, and they're factored into policy decisions moving forward. And I think the community and voluntary sector can absolutely assist with that, building on that moving forward.
Thanks, Tracy. I have to bring this to a close. There was one comment made on the chat screen earlier to do with the possibility that there are so many organizations around, and now with remote working, etc., should we not looking at mergers and at rationalizing some of these groups. But then there's a very interesting comment in from Mary Hennigan, who suggests that smaller groups have a lot going for them. They're more responsive, they're more fleet-footed, they can be more focused and more specific in their work. So I suppose that's a debate that will continue. I think the sector does morph and respond in new shapes and sizes as it deals with particular problems as they arise. I want to give the panel members, if I, just in case I didn't give everybody a full chance to say what is uppermost on their minds, a closing sentence. Amy, I'll start with you.
Put me on the spot there, Tom. Thanks. I think, yeah, in closing, anyone who knows me knows I'm a bit of an eternal optimist. So I think what we saw over the last kind of 14, 15 months has really just put a spotlight on the challenges and the opportunities that we have. And I think we've so much to learn from it, and it's almost too much to take in one go. But I think certainly from a volunteering perspective, there's a lot of change happening, a lot of opportunity for organizations, and yeah, very unique and exciting times as we move to what I hate to call the new normal.
Thanks, Amy. Sarah, I'll go to you.
Great, thanks, Tom. So I suppose just picking up on Peter's point around collaboration there, and that's a lot of what we've talked about today really is new systems of collaboration. I think all collaboration needs to be based on a certain level of trust and understanding between the groups present. And I suppose I don't think necessarily that understanding is fully there at the moment, and that's why that kind of public engagement work is so important now, so that when we're entering into those spaces to have that collaborative work to advance on policy that actually best serves marginalised groups and those that we work with and support, that we're entering on a level playing field that already has a baseline of understanding what we do, why it's important and why it needs to be prioritised and resourced, and why it's vital that work is enabled and supported to be continued. So I suppose that is a really crucial levelling of the playing field, so that we are coming in at that same level of understanding to those who hold the collaborative power to make for the sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Or Sarah, that's really interesting. I'll go to you, Tracy.
Great, thank you. I suppose what I would say is I am humbled to be working in the community and voluntary sector, particularly during this time. I think it has absolutely challenged us all in terms of our leadership and our ability to be adaptive. But I think that we are in a really strong position moving forward. I think we need to keep our focus on those that we serve, and I think our values will continue to assist us to do that moving forward and draw from that.
Thanks, Tracy. Peter, can I go to you?
Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, well, first of all, as I said at the beginning, I do think there is a big opportunity for the sector to play a key role in shaping the future in the health and social care area, but as I said, in collaboration with others. And that is a requirement to engage in developing a shared understanding of what we want for the future, and then that driving a problem-solving approach in implementing that shared understanding. And the final point I'll make is I agree with your point, Tom, or the point that was made from the floor in this question of big and small. There is a need for mergers. There is a need for greater collaboration between organizations in delivering integrated services, but it's not a matter of big organizations, small organizations. I suffered that myself from a whole range of unions in the 1990s, all decided to merge with each other, and it didn't end up as being the best outcome for what might happen, because some of the mergers made absolutely no sense, as opposed to being very focused on how you, as I say, deliver integrated services across sectors.
Thanks, Peter. And Dan, you're... Yeah,
thank you. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think that what we need, what I'm hoping is that it's not like childbirth. So, you know, it's a, you know, what you come out with something and suddenly you forget, you know, and I'm hoping that we don't forget. I'm hoping that we don't forget the learning. I'm hoping that we can remember that change comes from civil society. Lots of very, very positive changes have their roots in civil society. I'm hoping that the critical nature of the community sector and the voluntary sector, that has been established, that it's been established in the minds of the public and in the minds of our policymakers. And I'm hoping that won't be forgotten either. But I'm also hoping that the sector is valued for what it is and not for what policymakers think it should be, and that we challenge, for example, this drift towards commissioning, which I do think leads to autocratic responses as opposed to, you know, very, very creative responses. So that is my hope, actually, that we don't forget and that we build on the learning and that we maintain the very critical collaborations and partnerships that have been developed.
Well, what a great way to close. It seems to me our panelists, Amy, Sarah, Tracy, Peter and Anne, they were asked to deal, you know, to act almost like a prophet in terms of reading the future. But they always say a prophet doesn't so much have a good take on the future as much as has a really good, interesting take on the present. And what we've had here is a really interesting take on the present. 5 fantastic presentations. I've learned a huge amount. I'm deeply grateful to you all, as I'm sure are the 220 people who joined this discussion. So thank you so much. I'm now going to hand it back to Ivan. Ivan Cooper is the Director of Public Policy at the Wheel, and will bring the event to a close, I think, Ivan. So I'll hand it to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Well, once again, everybody, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of the attendees today, what a wonderful plenary session on day 2 of our annual conference. A huge thank you on behalf of all the attendees here this morning and this afternoon to Tom, Tracy, Peter, and Sarah and Amy. What a wide-ranging session that dovetails really well, in fact, with yesterday's plenary as we work in the Wheel to working with our members and with the sector more widely to develop a post-COVID vision for the community and voluntary sector to work towards. Big takeaways from me from this morning's plenary are that it really is all about the values. Values that were latent, as Tom described them, and which underpinned the beautifully put reservoir of the community response that was there to be drawn on when the moment came, because the capacity was there and had been invested in over the years. Values that which will underpin increased collaborative working, which many of the contributors this morning have talked about, both in the sector and between the sector and with statutory partners. Values that will position the sector to work to make sure that there is no slippage back to the old way of doing things, which we're conscious the risk is there and there are straws in the wind that point that way. That considerations that put funding considerations first. So we need to work hard, and it's the values we'll be drawing on that will enable us to achieve that aim. Values that demand increased investment in community development and in investing in communities to counter increased inequality and marginalization, and in supporting volunteering too. So, these are huge takeaways. Just to touch on some points that I heard, the rejuvenation of the values that has happened was one of the great things as a result of the crisis. As Tracy noted, the focus on collaborative partnership within the sector and between the sector and the state. And these again are the values that we all share, and the common glue that binds us together, I think, provide us with the basis to lead on the basis of. Sarah again returned to this theme of values, fundamental return to the values that are the most important during the crisis, but both for individuals and communities. The values looking at health and happiness and community and helping and equality and justice and inclusion and fairness. And these are the values, again, that will enable us to support and advocate professionally and do underpin all of that, and the need to ensure that these values are not demoted post-crisis. And again, talked about the potential of collaboration, that theme, and how the sector has worked in many new ways with public health and social services, and breakthroughs have been made, indeed, in relation to services and supports that have been sought for years, and the potential in all of that, and that the state needs to view the voluntary sector not just as something that's funded or commissioned to deliver services, but as instead, a necessary investment in the future. And I thought in particular, Anne's closing remark there, that we don't forget that the change that came from the COVID experience, and we don't unlearn that stuff, and the sector is valued for what it is and not what perhaps the state sometimes wants it to be. Peter, then again, this theme of collaboration coming through, the high degree of collaborative working that came through, that the NESC report is capturing. We're very much looking forward to working with the Health Dialogue Forum on that, and talked again about how the unity of purpose came through in relation to voluntary organisations working with statutory counterparts, the intense engagement that was there, very much experienced by members of the Wheel, and the collaborative problem-solving approach. And can we not, this is the opportunity to hardwire that approach in and hopefully deliver on Paul Reid's commitments made to Peter. And Amy talked again about, we talk about values, but the values are a basis for action, and the huge desire, as Amy put it, for people who want to volunteer, and volunteering is a way to do something and act on their values. So I just thought I'd pull some of those big themes that I heard from the contributions out. I'm really looking forward to reviewing the transcript of this morning's session, and the way that it dovetails back in to themes that emerged yesterday, the need for ongoing dialogue with the state and for civil society to have a voice in the post-COVID reconstruction, a real voice. And indeed, we've been calling consistently throughout the conference, and our main message from the summit is also for an inclusive dialogue with government as our key message and the takeaway. The need, other themes yesterday, the need to expand the role of the CV sector beyond marginalised groups, and hardwire it in as front and centre. The need for the community and voluntary sector to win recognition for the full impact of our work. Another theme that came through in Sarah's contribution on storytelling that came through today. And the need in the post-COVID world that we don't return to a competition for resources narrative that came through strongly yesterday. We know, we've heard reference from Tracy and Anne that that breakthroughs were possible when community need was prioritized above available resources. We can do it, and we need to make sure that we continue to do it to ensure that we prioritize the right things, and we demonstrate to ourselves that the money is there if we make the right prioritization decisions. I could go on, and it's not my job to summarize this amazing session, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody who's been attending here understands that the Wheel has heard these messages, and we're very looking forward to working with our collaborative partners in advancing all of these issues as we move on from this very strong place. So I just have a few formal remarks now to make, if you'll bear with me for 1 minute, and we'll bring the morning's plenary session to a close. We'd like to sincerely thank Taoiseach Micheál Martin for his contribution yesterday morning. We look forward to continuing to strengthen collaborative working into the future with government. Of course, we would like to thank all of our panelists this morning. Sincere thanks to Professor Tom Collins and to our panelists, Dr. Tracy Monson, Peter Castles, Alan Irwin, Sarah Mona and Amy Woods. And I'm just clapping on behalf of the hundreds of people here because they can't participate in that round of applause. Our special thanks to Paul O'Sullivan for his inspiring opening words this morning in his capacity as chair of the final summit, as chair of the Wheel. Many thanks, of course, to all of the staff of the Wheel who make our annual summit possible. And thanks to all of you for attending the sessions thus far. We really hope to see you at this afternoon's sessions too. Many thanks to Minister Joe O'Brien for giving his time to speak with Deirdre earlier today. Just excuse me 1 moment. Yeah, thank you. For giving his time to speak with Deirdre earlier today. Deirdre presented the Minister with a special gift from a local social enterprise, We Make Good. This copper jug is a modern take on a traditional traveller tinsmith made jug and is designed by Jonathan Blaney, a Dublin-based product and furniture designer. It's inscribed, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." So I think it just encapsulates our theme for our conference. And indeed, it's almost a theme for the Wheel, if you want to call it that, in our amazing membership of almost 2,000 member organizations at this point. So a most fitting quote from Helen Keller, it in fact is, and I think a perfect note to end today's plenary proceedings on. See many of you this afternoon at our parallel sessions, I hope, both beginning at 2 p.m. You can choose from HR digital transformation and remote working as one, or a conversation on the future of social enterprise. Thank you all ever so much. It's been a privilege once again to be able to host such amazing contributors and have such interactivity at our conference. Thanks again to everybody most sincerely for a wonderful session this